Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know many people in the room. Some of you I don't know. It's so exciting to speak with people that we've never met before. Thank you to those who submitted to this session. We organized this with the idea of trying to bring together disconnected pieces of the sort of study of the use of games for, well, lots of different reasons, for research tools, for learning tools, for social science and model implementation and model calibration, as well as just as boundary objects, as brokering tools to help people with different understandings of the world connect with people. The way we've imagined this session, and I know we burnt a few minutes of it trying to get set up, but we've hoped to be able to have our 6 speakers present a few different things, and then make enough time, maybe 15 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes if we're fast and effective, to talk through ideas at the end, both with questions from the audience as well as from the speakers, and really just have a nice discussion of where we might go next. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that other than to say the order that we're going to follow here, slightly different than what you might see in your schedule, is we'll go with Tomas first, and then Hagar, and then Ruth, and then myself, Andrew, and then Cole, and then James. And then from there, we'll get chatting. So thank you for being here, and let's get going.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. So my name is Thomas Falk. I'm working for the International Food Policy Research Institute, one of the CGIAR centers. And we are working for quite some time on experiential learning game approaches, and I want to share some of our work. If I could change slides now. Okay, so you have seen that slide more or less just a few minutes ago, and this is basically my context. Really massive overexploitation, especially of groundwater resources, but also surface water resources in India. And we try to think a little bit outside of the box, and I hope you hear some connotation and basically a comment to what we have heard earlier in the morning. And really thinking of what would be really alternatives to addressing the water crisis in India, which is really dramatic. First of all, we start with acknowledging that water is a common pool resource which creates a high risk of social dilemmas, where there are short-sighted incentives for short-sighted decisions or short-sighted actions which are not in the interest of the community in the long term. And that has to do with that it's difficult to exclude somebody from the use of groundwater. It now starts to be more regulated, how you drill wells, but overall for a long time this was not the case, and even today it's not really. And at the same time, it's difficult to understand the boundaries of the reservoir we are looking at, and it's not easy to see how you deplete it because it's mostly underground and invisible. Yeah. And then in the context of surface water, there is always the need, in particular, also for groundwater, of course, but in surface water also there is a need of investing in infrastructure which is for the benefit of the community, which creates, again, another social dilemma. So we are interested in particular in games which tackle or which capture social dilemmas. The starting point was that we used behavioral experiments in order to learn about your resource users' behavior, and then we learned as we applied these tools that this is a great learning tool, and we adapted the games more and more to become learning games. So this is just to give you one example of one of our games so that you have an idea what we talk about. It's a public good game if you are familiar with this typology of experiments. But this is not an experiment. This is a game. There is no treatment in it. So we play with 5 players. Usually we play separately with men and women. And then they have the choice between 2 crops, because our narrative is very clearly, if you want to change the system towards a more sustainable state, then you need to go away from the systems, from the cropping systems which are currently practiced. And the most effective way is really to shift to crops which are less water intensive. Much better than even more efficient irrigation technologies which just influence the return flows. So they have the choice between two crops. One crop is more water intensive and slightly more profitable, and the other one is less water intensive but gives you less profit. And then there are some details, some water for domestic use is also deducted to make it more realistic. And then will be played over multiple rounds, and every round there will be recharge, which is basically what comes through the rainfall back into the system. And sometimes this is determined, the amount of rainfall. Sometimes we have a probability function here, how much rainfall will be coming back. And so you can imagine that if the group grows crops which take more water than is recharged, then the water table drops. And we see this type of charts here where there is then a marker which goes further down and down if the groundwater is depleted. And until we reach a level where we say this water cannot be used anymore for human consumption or irrigation. So it's not that usually the wells fully dry up, but they become saline or not usable, or it becomes not economic anymore to lift the water. And we have rounds with communication, without communication. The main purpose here, it's a little bit different to what we use in behavioral experiments. The logic of first playing without communication is that our partners highlighted that after they have played without communication, they appreciate the opportunity to communicate much more once it's given to them. So strengthening this idea that it's okay. Then something, and a very important element of it is the debriefing. So we are not just playing the game and then leaving the communities. It's important to bring even a larger group together and let them discuss what they have learned from the game, connect what they have learned from the game to their real-life water management challenges, and discuss solutions. So partially they can already find solutions within the game, but the debriefing is more important even here. So this is just to give you the figure shall illustrate that we try to conceptualize a theory of change. So what is it that we actually can influence with our games? This starts with influencing mental models, system understanding, but also norms, water-related norms. And then from there, we hope that to some extent decision-making can be influenced, and eventually behavior then. And behavior here refers either to crop choices or to investments in water infrastructure. And we see really a rise of the use of games in extension or in supporting behavioral changes. But most of the applications we see are rather small scale. So there's a strong effort in the participatory development of games very often, but then the sessions which are played are rather with very few groups. So we try to bring this really to a larger number, trying to develop a game which is relatively simple to facilitate. We train community members in facilitating the games, and then as you can see, this was the ambition. I think in the meantime, we reached 1,200 communities directly, but more than 3,000 indirectly through partners with using our tools. We did a rigid impact assessment with a subsample of the treated sites. 314 treated sites were included in our impact assessment, and we compared them with 158 control sites, which were not treated yet. So it's a plan to treat them in future. And overall, we have 5,667 individual observations, so individual players who participated in our sessions. And this is just to give you some few ideas of our results. On the one hand, so what is exciting? Let's start with the results we wanted to see. 1 minute? Yeah. So we see that women who participated in our games afterwards in our follow-up survey reported more likely that they participate in agricultural decision-making. We also see that players of our games more likely reported that they contributed to water infrastructure maintenance. We did, however, not see that our index for system understanding improved or our norm indicator improved, which challenges our theory of change. While, I mean, what is most important is we wanted to change behavior, and we are closer to that. But something we still need to figure out is how our theory of change works there. So just in general, important was the process of co-designing the tools, bringing the partner in, really making sure that the game reflects the challenges which the people are facing, we are playing the game with. We also observed that some of our tools were not really applicable at some sites, so it was important to support facilitators in selecting the right tool for the right site, so context really matters as well. And just in general, I don't have time now to talk about that in detail, but the requirement of experiments for research are very different to what we need if we want to use a game for playing, for learning. Yes, these are some references. And just very briefly, we have a panel at the International Association for Studying the Commons conference in June, accepted also on games. If you are interested in this stuff or working on this, you are encouraged to submit a paper as well and attend. Thank you.
And I left out a couple of details as we're preparing, so we'll try to go for about 10 minutes if we can to leave time for discussion. As the next speaker is coming up, if you have a burning, clarifying question, just excitedly raise your hand, but otherwise we'll try and hold our discussion time for the end. And the next speaker is ElDidi.
Started, okay. So while it's getting loaded, my name is Hagar ElDidi. I'm at the International Food Policy Research Institute, also working with Thomas in the same team. And I will be talking on behalf of my team about our experience in adapting that game that Thomas explained to fit a slightly different context, and that is salinity in part of Ghana. Yes. So our motivation, I think Thomas covered a lot of this already, so I'll go through it fast, is this idea that, experiential learning and games in general have been found to be useful to identify behavioral patterns around natural resource management and kind of sort of shape the underlying mental models for people, how they perceive resources. And so we've been recently trying to take this more as a learning tool to foster collective action rather than just study it. And after some of the interesting findings that there was a pilot in India before the scaling up study that Thomas mentioned, we've been looking at piloting this in different contexts. So we looked at sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia and Upper East region in Ghana, because these are slightly different. So the groundwater scarcity situation is not super high like in India, but it's still a really good opportunity to sort of plant those seeds ahead, because they do experience growing scarcity, but they also don't have that very long history of community groundwater irrigation and the norms that could come with it. So in all of this time, our main research questions in all these different pilots were to know to what extent this intervention of games can help change the individual mental models or perceptions for groundwater specifically, and to what extent it could lead to communities' kind of collective action to address the sustainability issues. And we've been realizing that adapting this game to context would be really important to first to fit different contexts and also to be more useful and more relevant to the communities, because not every community this would be very relevant. And when we tried to do the game in Keta, the University of Ghana was interested in this, but they were dealing in Keta with a different problem. It was not just water shortage, there was more saltwater intrusion and salinity because they're on the coast. So we tried to test this game in a different, like a little bit of a different tweak. Does it work? Sorry. Yeah, okay. So this is the Keta Strip. It's lying between the salty Keta Lagoon and the sea, so a lot of saltwater intrusion issues. And it's in the driest part of the country in Ghana, so it's relatively dry spells in the rainy season, and high evaporation. And the farming communities there don't really have many livelihood options, so it's just mostly farming, and they depend on it for the growing vegetables and other food crops for both the consumption and income. There are some fishers, but mainly it's just farming. And of course, groundwater is recharged by the rain, so it really works well for this game where you can see the recharge is helping. But there's declining groundwater tables, and the salinity is really affecting crop yields in the dry season. So this is the original game, which Thomas had mentioned, the crop choice game, which was adapted in these different contexts. But in Keta, we try to change that. So instead of it being a crop choice game, we look at it as sort of, like the choice is more on the farm size. So how many plots does the farmer choose to irrigate? And then, so if they choose to irrigate just one, there's enough replenishment to keep us going well forever. And then if they choose 3, they'll get obviously more income, but then crash the groundwater table very fast, and something in the middle. And then we also changed it slightly so that this yellow zone, when they see that everybody makes their individual choices, and then they see the collective change on the groundwater table. If they reach the yellow, then their incomes start to drop as well, because then we assume there's salinity and the crop yields are affected. But everything else more or less remains the same. So we went to 10 communities in 2 districts, and we started with a focus group discussion baseline. Then we do the game separately for women and men. We have a pre-game survey, and then they play the game, and right after the game we do another post-game survey, and that's sort of to try to capture immediate changes in thoughts or like mental models before and after the game. Then the community-wide debriefing, that's, as Thomas mentioned, very important. Also for the spillover effects, because there are only 5 and 5 people who play this. So if you really want to have more people, reach more people, then this is one of the most important things to do. And then we went 3 months later to see if they really retain those lessons or not. Thank you. So I won't go through this in detail, but in-game behavior is very much in line with the India games and the Ethiopia games, that we see that once you introduce communication, and then we also had another round where they could communicate but also make rules if they choose to, so every group can make rules, and that's sort of to first try to induce this brainstorming, but also see what they come up with, because they probably have very good ideas. So these communication rounds and communication with rules have an effect on making players choose more water conservation choices, and that's actually was very stronger for female groups. I don't show this here, but we do find that. But yeah, let me skip through this. But yeah, I mean, generally, if you are part of a water user association, or if you're part of a farmer cooperative, or you've been living longer in the village, that also had a positive effect. And this is like the sort of right after the game, we see some changes in the perceptions. They were already doing well, that they did not think that, if farmers around them irrigate more, they would have more water, because we did see this in some other communities, but in this community it was, not much learning to be done here, but still improves. And then there's more on thinking through, yes, community members should act collectively to manage groundwater. We should have some sort of rule, so we're not, farmers are not supposed to be doing whatever they want, kind of, with their groundwater, and that the groundwater used now will affect us in the future. So these are some changes, so you could see that they change before and after. And then this is also, it was an open-ended question about what they think they should be done to improve groundwater, and a lot of the nothing, or I don't know, or it just depends on rainfall and there's nothing we can do, reduces, and we have more on regulating groundwater abstraction and setting rules, more on community action, less on drilling more wells, more on education, more on reducing farm size, just because this is what the game kind of is talking about. But also interesting, some people were thinking about building dams and harvesting rainfall, which is great. And that doesn't really come up because the game just talks about the demand side. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, communities do always have great ideas. And then 3 months later, we do see that there's a lasting effect of at least the learning of the characteristics of groundwater resource and the need for collective governance, and also the shifting away from the belief or the rejection of groundwater rules towards more understanding the need for collective action. But even though that's the case, we also have some communities that were still very averse to rules. And all of the communities were actually very concerned, and this is not like the other pilots that we looked at. All of the communities were talking about how this groundwater rule enforcement would be impossible. There were fears that there is no alternative livelihood, and this would lead to hunger and poverty if we limit water use or plot sizes and such. But there were also some individual changes on thought and kind of people trying to change ways to get more water in the future. Whoops. Yeah, so these are some quotes. You can read them at your leisure, but this one I like a lot because it says, I did research on the crop that uses less water at Endline, and this is not something we talk about in this adaptation of the game. So it shows that people are trying to really think about different ways to conserve water. And finally, so games, we really love games, we do games all the time, but we see them as just the first step. So yes, they do change those mental models, but they really need to be seen as part of a package deal, which is what Thomas was explaining. And this works very well in India, but in these other cases there, we don't really have presence on the ground or NGO presence or extension presence that we can have longer term engagement with. So we do need other tools to support the communities to sort of take those homegrown ideas and their thoughts about collective action solutions and their knowledge and give them the tools they need, equip them with the tools. Because they did express a need for education, for extension, things. And we need to also be looking at supply side solutions, not just the demand side. The game manages the demand side, but the discussion should really be more about supply as well. Yes, and then there's an opportunity for co-creation of the games, for thinking about this more than just doing a scoping study very fast and then, giving them the game as it is. And we're trying to do that more going forward, and like proposals, trying to look at this as part of the project itself. And that's it. What happens after endline is just thinking through embedding these interventions in larger packages with extension, with local NGOs, to really make this like more useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ruth, I'll get your talk loaded up, and we're going to see if we can raise the speaker level just a little bit.
As we wait for the presentation to be loaded up, my name is Ruth Njiro. I'm from the Leibniz Institute for Agricultural in Transition Economies, based in Germany, and I'm going to present something on strategic decision-making in land rental markets using a reinforcement learning approach. So basically the idea is, how can we better model how farms decide how much to bid in land rental markets? And first thing we see is, like, especially for developed countries, land rental market become a key figure in determining how farms grow. Oh, finally. Perfect. Like I said, agricultural rental market determines how farms grow, especially for developed economies. So first of all, some basic background is that they enable us to redistribute land from people who are not using the land to people who are using the land. And with the current increase in land prices, we see it's no longer affordable for farms to buy land, so it's easier for them to rent land. And also they affect how farm structure changes. So we see some farms will exit farming when it will no longer become profitable for them to farm. Some farms will take new land and become benefits from economies of scale. And so how do now farms decide how much to rent? And one of the things is that it's not something that is fixed. They have to decide based on various ideas. First of all is, what are their individual expectations about this land? How much do they have in terms of capacity? How much, for example, investments do they have? How much people do they have to produce? So they have to also factor it, and also they have to take into consideration land-specific qualities. For example, if you're doing arable farming, your requirements in terms of soil quality might be different from if you're doing you're keeping livestock. And so current models assume that these, for example, you use fixed-based heuristic. So they instead, like, you decide how much to bid using a certain fixed percentage, which does not always work, because you assume every farm makes the decision the same way, but these farms are different in terms of also their expectations and how the knowledge of the farm managers. Also, they assume that the farmer is perfectly rational, and we know that's not possible in these days. We also base our decisions based on other things. And also, some of them focus on short-term optimization instead of looking at how long-term this would affect the farm growth. So to that effect, we need models that would better adapt how does the farm adapt to changes in the environment, long-term planning, and how much, based on how much knowledge and experience the farm have, how do they manage this, and how do they interact with other farms in the course of bidding decisions. So in that, we decided to implement reinforcement learning in AgriPolicy. I will explain what AgriPolicy is in the next slide. So we try and find a bidding strategy that does three things. How does it come up with bids that would guarantee farm growth? Then how would you factor in what you've played before? Like you see, even in bidding decisions, it will be, I bid this much previous years, did it work for me, did it not work for me? Do I need to bid the same amount, or should I go higher, should I go lower? So it also factors in that information. And lastly, how do explore new bidding strategies? So if something worked, can I also now decide on something else. So that's the main idea of reinforcement learning, where you have the agent who interacts with the environment. So, it's there. So for that we have an artificial landscape. So AgriPolice is an agricultural policy-based simulator, which is used to simulate the effect of policy changes to the structure of agriculture within a period of time. So for that we do it on a regional based scale, where you have different farms. So these different farms produce different activities, so they all determine how much to produce, what to produce, when to produce. And they also have different resources. As we know, agriculture is resource constrained, so based on the resources, they take actions in the environment. And then they interact with each other, and the main way they interact is through the land rental market. And that's where they compete for different plots of land, and also based on the wider policy environment. So, for example, in Germany currently they are coming up with policies to limit land prices, so we'd see how that would affect the structure. So, like I said, the land market is central because of the interaction effect. So you do the land market in terms of an iterative auction market, where we have free plots of land. So we have, let's say, for example, two farmers. Farmer A decides to bid this amount of money. Farmer B decides to bid this amount of money. So the farm with the highest, who bids the highest amount, wins the plot of land. And then it continues on until all the plots are allocated. So in terms of this, for the reinforcement learning, we set up a small region where we have 7 different farms, and we chose farms that are active in the land market. So these are farms that continuously rent the land, and all these farms are different and they are stable. Why? Because the stable, that we don't want the farms dropping out during the experimental setup. So we only have one agent, agent number 4, which is the deep reinforcement learning agent. So he exploits different bidding strategies, where the standard agent used the fixed based rule bidding strategy that's in the current AgriPolice model. So for the standard agent, the bid is calculated as a function of the bidding coefficient. And the work of the bidding coefficient is that, let's say, for example, you expect I'll make 1,000 euros from this plot of land. I will not spend all the 1,000 euros to rent that plot of land. I will spend a fixed amount, and then the rest goes to cover taxes, and also will also come towards your profit expectations. So normally we set this bidding coefficient at 0.5%, and from previous research has shown that if you, it's sort of a plateau. If you go higher, it gets to a point where if, let's say, you bid all your money and set it to 1, it won't result in the amount of money that you would make normally, because you also need to spend on other investments. So in this sort of, for the deep reinforcement learning agent, we also makes his decision not only based on this, but also based on variables that would indicate farm conditions. So how much, for example, liquidity, so how much money do I have? Sector conditions would include how many farms am I competing with, and how much money have they spent on renting land in previous years. And also takes into account long-term planning. For example, you have your investments, and this investment at some point will become obsolete. So I need to plan when these investments become obsolete, I still have money to bid on. I still have money to renew them. So this is what it takes into consideration, and of course, experience. So experience, how much money have I paid in the past? So what we did, we integrated deep reinforcement learning into AgriPolice, and I'll just go quickly over it. And then, so it determines how much you bid, and then the information is transmitted back to the deep reinforcement learning framework. So in the study design, we simulated a baseline scenario, so that's what would happen with the agents before reinforcement learning. Then we initialized the learning environment, and then we ran the simulations where we collected training data, we updated the buffer and all this. So quickly through the results, one thing is that we see that the agent that was using deep reinforcement learning, deep reinforcement learning performed better than the agent where you use a fixed bidding rule of 0.5. And you can see right from the onset of this, starting of this training, we see an increase in how much they bid. And then we compare in terms of how much did they grow. So we use equity capital as a measurement, and we see there was a 7.29% increase in the amount of money they made at the end of the run. And we also compared how much rented land did they rent, and we see that there was an increase in the amount of rented land, and also that the bidding coefficient kept on changing. It was not like a fixed of 0.5, but changed based on this condition, this variable that was stated. And we also see it had an effect on other farms where, for example, if you follow the green farm, used to perform better during the baseline scenario, but it's overtaken by the deep reinforcement learning in this other scenario. Also, something interesting that we noticed is that there was increase not only in intensification in terms of the new framework, but also there were also a bit of diversification into new crops. So what does it mean? So we see increased farm size, we see increased production, we see increased diversification. We see them renting more land. This could be a potential source of market power, but we still have to test it. And then going forward, we are going now to look at it. Like I said, this was only a small region, but of course, regions would be bigger. So how would this affect if the region was bigger and you have more competitors? But of course, we have some challenges, and then now we'll go and see how does this now affect land market regulations in coming up years. So thank you. If you want to discuss this further, we can meet afterwards. Okay.
Okay, now it's my turn. I won't run to the back, but I wonder if we could have the talk labeled Bell to come up. And just while I'm waiting, my name is Andrew Bell. I'm an associate professor of global development at Cornell University. Been doing games and modeling for 10 or 20 years and trying to think about useful ways to do them, ways to connect them, and in the last 10 years, a lot more of an emphasis on how can we learn more about people, how people actually make decisions and learn from that for experiential learning purposes, for game calibration purposes. And what I'm going to do, our colleague Sarobidy Rakotonarivo couldn't join us, and so I've folded some of her current work into my talk. I've elected not to show any results. I'm just going to do a bit of a dance across a number of the different games that we use in a way that I hope is helpful. Okay, so we started doing games work using the NetLogo platform. This is an agent-based modeling platform. It's a teaching tool that happens to have this really nice functionality that students can be interactive in agent-based modeling simulations, which also means that we basically have a tool where if people click on a screen, we get a message that says, this person clicked here. And that turns out to be all the ingredients you need to build a nice, robust multiplayer game. We've applied them in a number of different places. The first game that we built is non-crop share. This is this game we played across South and Southeast Asia, looking at farmer willingness to move away from pesticides towards natural enemy services like parasitic wasps and spiders as a means of pest control, with this sort of coordination challenge that if my neighbor sprays and I don't, I lose my wasps, I'm in trouble. So we started with this question of how do we encourage that and encourage people to take on the risk of coordination. And from there, we moved into a related context, looking at pest animal species management in a few different places. So this is looking at farmer willingness to engage non-lethal control as opposed to lethal control of pest animal species. We played it first in the Orkney Islands. This is where we got the name Goosebump, but we continued to play it on. We played in Gabon, we played in Tanzania, looking at elephants, looking at lions as well. And we also then moved into a slightly different space, looking at sort of the role of property rights and sort of private versus group control of land in leading choices for optimal fallowing in sort of a slash and burn system. So in this first family of games, we sort of have, for the most part, sort of symmetric and slightly asymmetric coordination problems where there's some kind of like a production and an environment goal in tension, and we're trying to understand, what are the ways in which we can shift behavior around this sort of environment production dilemma. So the way we did this is, at the time, we we put the game on tablets. We had this thing here as a mobile hotspot. No longer exists as a technology. You just use your smartphone, you set up a mobile hotspot and do whatever you like. But this allows us to have a game set up where computers can talk to each other, even if there's no internet, no matter where you are. And so in whatever context you can bring real people who are using the resource you care about together to play a game, you can do this quite easily. So where we've kind of moved in the last 10 years is trying to more carefully thread the needle between games for research and games for learning. And so we've sort of borrowed Tomas's theory of change that he presented in his talk to kind of think about how can we focus in on what it is that sort of changes across gameplay. And we have this idea that where you have this real life, you can learn from your own experiences, of course, we know this, but real life is dangerous and we don't always get the opportunity to experience things. So the idea of the experiential learning game context allows us, we have this sort of experiential learning action situation that gives us a chance to learn without necessarily exposing us to real life danger. And so for us, in a lot of the work we're doing is we're kind of asking, one, are we able to recreate crucial elements of real life in the game? And can we observe whether people's sort of attention has shifted through the process of playing the game? I think we have the idea that learning happens through the attention you place on things and how salient they then become as you experience these same things in the future. We don't expect that people come out of our games with an entirely different worldview, but we think maybe they've changed a little bit what they're going to pay attention to as they experience similar things in the coming weeks or months. And so typically, the intervention design we've landed on after some tweaking is where we have a game, we'll often start, well, I should say that this isn't where we start. We start with focus group work and expert consultation as a process of trying to identify the dilemma that we care about. But once we feel like we have a game we're ready to apply, we'll do community level surveys to learn a little bit about the context that we're in. We'll do some work up front to try and measure people's underlying beliefs. And often we do a discrete choice experiment to look at people's sort of instantaneous preferences and attitudes towards dimensions of the problem they care about. And just as an example of what that is, this is a sample from a game I'll share in just a minute, where we're looking at pastoralists' willingness to maintain large herds in the sort of space of like scarce water and land resources, and we're looking at the sort of how they spend their time, the size of their herds, and the losses that they experience, and we're asking people to sort of choose among different hypothetical realities or whether they'd like to stick with their own. And across a large number of choice tasks, we learn a little bit about how much those different dimensions matter to them. So across our intervention, we measure instantaneous preferences. We spend some time training and learning the game. We take a break because everyone's tired. We'll often come back the next day. We'll play the game with the intervention we've designed. We'll measure people's preferences again, and then we'll get together for the debrief sessions that my other colleagues have talked about, where again, people who didn't play the game, anyone who's interested to join, kind of joins us in the discussion, and we figure out what is it that we learned, or what is it that this game forced us to think about differently. So I'll just give a couple of examples of games we've developed recently since that first wave of games. We're moving away from the sort of symmetric coordination world and trying to represent different kinds of dilemmas. This is a game called Green Reserves that we played in Ethiopia and Kenya. And here the dilemma is for pastoralists to make decisions among, in land that we share, how much of it should be truly open and how much of it should be, you need permission to use it. How do we divide our efforts across moving our herds around versus doing dry forage harvesting? And then how do we coordinate across the group of people with whom we're sharing this land so that we make the best use of this sort of scarce grass resource? This is another example we played recently in the vanilla producing region in northern Madagascar called Follow Me. And so vanilla is this like amazing, exciting thing that is like so lucrative, but at the same time is subject to all kinds of supply chain shocks and can be, where the market disappears, farmers who've invested heavily in vanilla can be in trouble. And so in this game we were looking to see, really to answer the question, if we believe things like mixed vanilla agroforestry could be a viable alternative or kind of like a way to back up and support vanilla farmers, how lucrative does it need to be, or what does it need to provide in order that vanilla farmers would be willing to choose it and mix their land doing it? And so here our farmers are making decisions between vanilla and mixed other crops. They're making decisions about how to make use of fallow land and possibly increase like ecosystem service spillover of where I'm got cropland that's close to vegetation, it restores better. And whether or not when there's open shared land, whether I should cut it or leave it for other people. This is a new game that we're developing just now. This is Watergate. I spent a lot of time on the game names, probably like more than I ought to. But here we're developing this for a system in northern Pakistan where there's sort of a two-basin problem where you have an upper basin and a lower basin with a gate managing water in between. And you have this challenge of both parts of the basin wanting to avoid scarcity, also to avoid flooding, and to make the best use of water resources that they can. So we have teams of water users deciding what water demand activities to do, and then how across them to manage water releases between the two basins. And the way we're playing this is teams play both positions. They play as the upstream and the lower stream riparian, and then we have a debrief where we talk through what did we learn from this and what do we get. And then a couple of last quick examples. This is a game we've built with what I'm calling more of a framework. Rather than programming specific games, we've built a sort of a grammar of agricultural resource games that can be described in a CSV file. And this is a game called Shared Cropping. We just piloted in Kenya with a group of farmers who have committed as part of a CGIAR program to do an aggregate farm. And the idea of this activity was to figure out what can we learn from this and what ought we be thinking about as we move into this new farming paradigm. So we built a game where farmers can choose what to do, how to share land, how to split their efforts. We played a couple different games, one where farmers were rewarded based on their individual scores, and then one where they were awarded based on the lowest playing or the lowest score in their team. And then we sort of talked through afterwards, how do we make choices differently and what does that possibly imply for the way we might move forward as aggregate farmers? And then it's just one last one, because I know I'm just about out of time. This is a sort of like a non-spatial framework we have called Farm Cards. And this is a game we've piloted also in Madagascar, looking at village savings and loan associations, or VSLAs, or AVEC in French. And here we're looking at what are the ways in which we can shape farmers' understanding of what a VSLA offers and the way it changes the kinds of risks that they could coordinate around. So here farmers choose, what am I going to invest in? What is our group going to invest in? Should we join the VSLA? And then how should we think about borrowing? Okay, so that's it. I know no one wants to see lists of things, so I tried to keep it as short as I could. But what I hope I showed across this was the things that we're doing, which are really trying to do the best we can to identify and simulate like a meaningful dilemma. We're trying to create some kind of an action context that maps well onto what people do in real life. And these first 2 points fit well into the sort of like challenges in external validity and construct validity that you see across the experimental economics and experimental social sciences space. We're also trying to sort of observe how people's attention changes along gameplay and understand what is it you're taking from the game and are these the things that we're hoping you'll take from the game, as well as understanding how players respond under different conditions. And across these two things, this is where we're trying to thread that needle of meeting learning objectives and research objectives in the same way. And that's something I hope we might spend a bit of time talking about. So yeah, mapping out this shared space. And then it's just as a last thing, I would say, for anyone in the room who's interested in doing games or wants to learn a little bit more about it, there's two big parts to this. It's this technical task of designing a tool, designing an intervention, and making it happen. But it's also this critical social scientist task of thinking through what belongs here and what do I think I'm getting from this. So we have on our lab page, we have a bunch of materials assembled and builder guides to kind of talk this through. But we also regularly do sort of 2 or 3 day workshops built around helping ECRs and graduate students get to a point where they could do games on their own. So if you're interested in attending one when we have one, or if you're interested in hosting one, get in touch and we can talk about it. And I think I'll stop there and pass to our next speaker, which is Cole.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Cole Perkinson. I'm a PhD researcher at MIT, and my research area is in solar energy and reducing heating in solar panels. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about game development and a different type of game than I think most of the other speakers here might be thinking about. Specifically, I want to talk about strategy tabletop games. They've become immensely popular in the last 10 to 15 years and have broad appeal across all age groups and increasingly has more diversity in terms of the who is producing the games and the topics the games are in. So caveat that this will be a very different talk than what you've seen. I want to give a brief personal background, and then the core of the talk will look at how board games have evolved, a brief history of board games through history, specifically themes of those games. And I want to talk about what makes a good pedagogical game. So how do you get a learning objective across to someone who's playing a game, maybe for fun? Maybe they pick up the game because they want to have fun. How do you get them talking about an idea through that game? And then I want to demo a game that I brought to the conference that I'm trying to develop. So a secret objective of mine in this talk is to try to convince any of you or anyone else at the conference who could give some feedback in the game I'm developing. I would love to show you. It's a 5 to 10 minute game, and I brought 5 copies with me to show around. So I'm from Portland, Oregon. I've been sort of very lucky and blessed to be in a place surrounded by a lot of natural beauty. I'm also very aware of the fragility of the landscapes that are around me, but I think where I'm from has instilled a deep appreciation of natural beauty and also fragility of those landscapes. I also grew up around a lot of puzzles and games, playing Civilization, playing Stratego, all of these games. I spent a year after graduating from college studying music and music composition in Zimbabwe. And this is where I designed my first game, actually as a side hobby. I'm also a juggler. I designed a game called Juggalinks to visualize juggling patterns. I then met one of my favorite game designers at the time, Rainer Knizia, in the UK, where I did a master's degree on solar energy at Cambridge University. And then my PhD, which I'm finishing now at MIT, is on reducing heating losses in solar panels. And I attended a large gaming convention called Gen Con and met another game designer, Vlada Chivadl, who has influenced my game design. And I'm involved in the Graduate Student Sustainability Committee, which this talk will be oriented around. So how have the themes of board games changed over time? So I want to give a brief overview of the history of gaming from the first known game that's been discovered in 3100 BCE called Senet up to the modern era. And I'm kind of broadly defining it in a few different time frames. I think old games, these games that we know, the earliest games that we've discovered tend to be either abstract or based on combat or territory control. I would say beginning in the early 1900s, what people, if you played Monopoly, started as a game called the Landlord's Game. And in the 1900s, a lot of the games, this is where you start to see games becoming much more popularized and commercialized, but the themes are still very limited to, there's a lot of games around capitalism, there's games around conquest and war and fantasy. And I think it goes to show what the people designing the games cared about, at least, and they made it into popular games for people to play. 1995, Settlers of Catan is where I kind of defined the beginning of like very sort of modern popular gaming. Here there's a lot of games that are developed that are about colonialism and empire building. If you look at a lot of the most popular games, there's still like, oh, there's some like white explorers coming in and extracting artifacts from a temple, or we're like, let's build a new empire and settle a new land. And I would really say like the diversity in game design for tabletop gaming has only started to increase a lot in the last 15 to 20 years. And I don't know if any of you have played Wingspan, but I think in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been an increasing push toward climate and environment themed board games. And with that push and increasing number of players of board games, there's an opportunity to incorporate learning as a component in what is sort of conventionally or traditionally thought of as just for fun games. These aren't serious games, but there's an opportunity to make them serious. All right, what makes a good pedagogical game? It needs to be a good fundamental game and fun on its own. And there's some game design mechanics that make sort of games that people want to pick up and play regularly just for fun. They want to play them over and over again. Games need to have intuitive mechanics. So you don't want to, even if you're reading through a list of like 20 pages of rules with lots of mechanics in them, once you start playing it or you see someone playing it, you want to feel like, ah, yeah, that rule makes sense for what I'm doing in the game. You want every choice a player makes in the game to be meaningful, that it has an outcome and will impact how the game evolves. You need there to be a catch-up mechanic, so as you play, the game Monopoly famously fails at this. You get behind, you start losing, you know you're going to lose, you have to play for 2 or 3 more hours. You need to have an option or some way to come back in the game. You either need to have quick turns or you need to have something to think about when it's not your turn. Games have gotten a lot better at that in recent era. And you want there to be a sense of development in the game, that you're doing something a little different in the end game than you are earlier in the game. Engaging theme helps. I'd say there's a lot of games that have sort of a pasted-on theme that is sort of an afterthought, but you can also start with a theme as an idea. And for learning games, you want to link every choice a player makes to the desired learning outcome of the game. So spend the rest of my talk just giving a brief demo of this game that I brought here and looking for some feedback on. It's called Carbon Line. The motivation of this game is the MIT administration came to the Graduate Student Council and said, we're putting on a dance party for the end of the year, and the theme is environmental sustainability. And we have a space called a learning lounge where when people are tired of dancing, they're going to hang out in the space. We want activities that are engaging and that also get people talking about environmental sustainability. So design something engaging for the learning lounge. So Carbon Line originated with that challenge, and the motivation for the game is that I think a lot of people that I speak to in the Boston area, there's like 30 universities there, a lot of people I speak to really care about preserving environmental sustainability, but we struggle with understanding relative impact of the choices we make on the planet. I was inspired by this book, How Bad Are Bananas, which goes into the carbon footprint of everything, but they look at the life cycle analysis of CO2 emissions and impact. And the objective is, I wanted to design a game that helps people develop a quantitative intuition around the choices we make as a society and as individuals. How do we compare the choices we're making? Where do we direct our attention? Every card in the game has a front of a card, like this, and a back of the card, which quantifies the environmental impact on the scale of kilograms of CO2 equivalent. The data from all of these cards comes from literature online. And so I want to take 1 minute to give a demo of the game. This is sort of an abbreviated version, but you have a carbon line of a list of say production of 1 kilogram of bananas, drying 1 load of laundry, and daily US per capita emissions. I just randomly selected those 3 from the deck of cards. Everyone is given a hand of cards, and on your turn, the choice is to choose one of your cards and place it into the carbon line, sorted from low to high on carbon impact. So where would you put, let's say, driving 30 miles to work? It's probably more than a load of laundry, less than US per capita emissions. Okay, sure. What about daily Mexico per capita emissions? Well, I assume it's probably less than the US, but could it be less than going to work? Actually less than the CO2 output from 30 miles round trip to work. And 1 kilogram of hard cheese, production of 1 kilogram of hard cheese, where would you throw that in the line? As the game progresses, it evolves to harder and harder decisions. And while it's hard to understand a direct number on its own, as people play the game, my hope is that they develop a more an ability to compare the choices and from various categories, be able to compare the impact, but also to inspire conversation around those choices. So hard cheese is actually more impactful than driving to work and Mexico per capita emissions. So I think I would love to, if anyone is like intrigued by this, it's a very different kind of game than you're talking about. If you want to try it out and give me some feedback or ideas of cards in the game, I would love to hear that. So games are fun. Even like I think there's no game that's not serious. Every game has a learning component to it. And I'd love to talk with anyone over coffee about how games that are thought of as just being fun, how we can make them more learning oriented, and how to do that successfully. Thank you.
And one more, and I think we've made ourselves a little bit of a buffer at the end for some nice discussion. Looking forward to it. Here you go.
Hi everyone, my name's James Millington. I know there's going to be a delay in getting my slides up, so I'll just start and introduce myself. I am interested in modeling land use change. My background is in behavioral modeling, and I think hopefully there's lots of people here interested in that. And if you are, here's an advert for the next session over in the room next door, 205R, on behavioral modeling. So I'm getting my advert in early. Come along to that one afterwards. We'll get into more behavioral models. I've never done any serious gaming before this project, which was with Ingrid. And a lot of the credit has to go to her for this because she did a lot of the work here. She's now working at the Norwegian Meteorological Institute, working on serious games there as well. She did a lot of the work. Hopefully I can answer your questions, but yeah, she's the real expert here. So our challenge, our problem, was focused in an alpine region in Italy. And as with many areas of mountainous areas in Europe, we've seen depopulation, land abandonment over the last couple of decades. And commensurate with this, we've seen increases in wildfire risk as land is abandoned, vegetation returns, and also adding in climate change as well. So we've got management challenges here, climate change, but also multiple stakeholders in these landscapes, and changing stakeholders, people leaving the landscape with rural to urban migration, but then also we're beginning to see people come back to these landscapes seeking a new or alternative life who actually don't have any kind of history of living in these landscapes, and also tourism really increasing. So our question here really was, how do we create fire-resilient landscapes? How do we embed participatory decision-making in the process of creating these landscapes? And how, as we've all been talking about, how can we foster adaptive learning across these spatial problems that we have with interacting, competing demands, competing desires? So this is just briefly our study area. Yeah, up in the kind of border, Italy, Switzerland. Almost 50% forest. The remaining area is high alpine pasture, but a lot of that's been abandoned, and so it's becoming shrubland. 8 municipalities here. We played this game in 3 municipalities. And here's a brief overview of the design, the game design process. So we did interviews with key stakeholders within the landscape, which allowed us to develop a conceptual model design, which we took back to some of those stakeholders and discussed with them. We played the game at King's College London, with colleagues in our lab. And this game really is kind of a hybrid agent-based model with some active gameplay from participants, and we'll have a look at that in a second. And we developed those two aspects kind of concurrently. So the key land covers we're looking at here: forest, pasture, pioneer, shrubland. the key roles, kind of 4 key roles we established within the landscape. And so players take one of these roles within the game, and we aim to have representatives of people who actually do these things in the landscape playing in every game. We weren't actually quite able to do that in one of the games, but we didn't do too badly. So we played this 3 times in 3 different municipalities, total of 23 players across the games. And one of the things, our aim here is to foster real-world relationships between the actual people who live in these landscapes and are actually trying to challenge with these problems through the game itself. So the gameplay, you can see bottom left here, a photograph from actually playing the game with participants. We're really trying to look here at social and economic dynamics, but also coupling that to ecological dynamics. So the social and economic aspect is what people are actually doing, playing, making decisions about how much to thin their part of the forest, how much rent the mayor is going to charge the pastoralists to graze that year, those sorts of negotiations. We'll see some of the decisions and interactions in a second. And then the ecological aspects are what we kind of simulate in the agent, I guess it's an agent-based model. It's a grid-based model, essentially. Here we can see we've got our 20 land parcels that we're making decisions over. Periodically within the game, fires ignite, and where those fires spread, which we simulate in the model, depends upon vegetation patterns across the landscape, which in turn has been influenced by the decisions that people have made at earlier stages in the game. So we kind of play 5 rounds within each game. Each round is supposed to represent a decade. The fires don't start until decade 3 or 4. So we've got some time to make some decisions, and then we see what the impact of those fires are later on. So the sorts of interactions between the players. So we've got decisions that people need to make. The forest consortiums, that's the public forest managers, need to decide about how much to cut, how much to thin. That kind of also depends a little bit in terms related to stumpage prices. So we've got some economics aspects in there. Municipal administration, that's essentially the mayor. The mayor in each municipality has quite a lot of power in these places, so they negotiate the rent that they charge the pastoralists, and consult with the forest managers about what their management decisions are going to be as we go through the game. Yeah, and so one of the things that we tried to do, and we weren't able to do this in every single game that we played, was for players to take roles that differ from their real-world position, to really get them thinking about things from, as we've seen in other examples, putting people in the shoes of others to try to understand the sorts of decisions that they're having to make. And we weren't able to do that in every game. As I said, the mayors have quite a lot of power in these places, and sometimes, they like to keep that power, even in the game. They don't want to be someone else, even in the game. Maybe there's good political reasons for that. Anyway, bit of a challenge. But on one occasion when we did get one of the forest managers to be the mayor in the game, this is the sort of reflection that they then later offered us. The difficulty of this is that you have to interact with multiple stakeholders at the same time. You have to deal with many people and issues simultaneously, which differs from my situation. This is a forest manager. They make decisions over decades about how much timber to cut out, and yeah, they've got to work with 1 or 2 colleagues, but they found being the mayor really actually quite challenging. Money comes in one way and goes out another, and in the end, it all goes out. And they've really struggled with this, but I think this is the sort of thing that we really want to get out of. We were aiming to get out of playing this game, so we're really happy when we kind of get this. So we kind of find, hopefully we find that. I'll talk a little bit about how we find this out in the next slide. So we did find that people find this a useful experience in many ways for bringing to the surface and actually being able to discuss the challenges that they know are out there. But actually doing it makes it real for them. They know it exists, it's in their head, it's in their mental models, they deal with it on a daily basis, but this really gave them an opportunity to interact and share those kind of mental models and those challenges. And it allowed clear identification of the obstacles to collaborating across the landscape to produce these fire resilient landscapes, and maybe to refine those issues a little bit. So our evaluation we took in a short term, so right at the end of the game, debriefing session, kind of as usual I think, kind of a survey on a Likert scale and kind of that kind of stuff, so quite structured. But But then also, we returned 2 years later to try and establish, well, how has this had a longer lasting effect? And that was kind of mediated by who we were able to go and talk to again when we went back. And really quite difficult. You know, we didn't take a very structured approach to this. Some people that we said to said, yes, well, we're now working in a kind of formal collaboration between, for example, the local firefighting brigade and the foresters, and we actually came together during playing the game. But also, they probably would have come together at some point around that time anyway. Maybe we sped up the process, but you know, there seems to be some evidence for that. Others said, no, we were already doing stuff like this, so, I mean, it was cool, but okay, thanks. So we find it, you know, really, really useful. For me, it was really great coming from the kind of agent-based modeling world and really seeing the value of this sort of approach for engaging with people. What I'm really interested in, and I'm here really to learn more about how to do this and get more involved in it, is how to start scaling this up. So hearing that people are doing this with thousands of participants is great, but for us to do this just with 23 in Italy was just a real a lot of work. So how to do that with many more people would be really great to learn about. Yeah, we've written this up as a paper, and it just got published this year, so that stuff's there if you want to have a look at it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for holding all of your questions. We now have 7 minutes left to get all of them. So what I'm going to suggest is, and one question, do we have a second microphone? Do we have a microphone that can walk? Do we have another one? Wonderful. So I'd like to prioritize questions from the audience to either individual speakers or to everyone. And we'll see how many we can get through. Don't feel captive. If you need to get out there and get ahead in the lunch line, there's no shame in that. And that for speakers and audience alike. But whoever is interested to kind of stick around, I think there's a lot to talk about. So what I'll do is just, I'm not a great moderator, but perhaps if you have a Estebi and you have a microphone coming to you.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you so much for organizing the panel. I don't work in this field, so this has been completely new to me. So I have some clarifying questions basically for Thomas and Hagar, just for the sake of curiosity. So the first question is, how do you choose the participants in your games? Is it purposive sampling, it's random, and whether you incentivize them in any way, like money or in-kind incentives to participate? The reason why I'm asking this question, you can imagine, is because since you are also expecting some behavioral change, if these games would create any sort of new governance conditions and so on, the people who participate in them is very important. Because if you engage the leaders, if you engage key people in the farming system and so on, you may have then this new knowledge flowing in a different way. So that's why I'm asking the question. And the second one has to do with the scaling up. And whether your projects have any strategy for the future to sort of partner with other organizations, NGOs, extension services who can use your game to basically reach more communities and have these more long-term effects that you would wish to have. So these are the two questions. Thank you so much for the work.
No, great question. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this as well. So first of all, yes, we think carefully who to invite to the sessions. Definitely not randomly. So what we usually, for the groundwater game, usually we look for more influential people in the community who play some kind of role in this way, also in some way also contribute to the debate in the community. At the same time, having said this, there's of course always the risk that then you have only men in the room, so we make sure that we have equal representation of men and women. Incentivizing, very interesting. It's something we are exploring. We have 2 papers on this where we use this actually as a treatment in our RCT. And we get a little bit ambiguous results. In the one study, it didn't have an effect. In the other one, we actually saw that if you make the typical incentivized payments as they are usually used in behavioral experiments, that the learning effect was stronger. Not tremendously, but we saw some effect. That, having said this, many partners don't like paying people for participating in activities. And in the big impact assessment, there was no payment involved. Then yes, I mean, basically you gave the answer to your second question. We are partnering with organizations. In India, it's one key strategy was to excite managers of large government programs about our approach. Basically, the first step is, of course, they want to see some evidence. Yeah, that if you talk to a commissioner, he will ask you, yeah, show me that it made a difference. But if you can convince the important decision makers that it's worth trying, then they integrate it. And now that we reach 4,000 communities indirectly is largely because it got integrated into large government programs in India. And we are using the same strategy with partners in Africa now, where we work with government agencies there as well. Yeah. You want to add something?
Yeah, thank you. And if I can add just something small, is that in India we've been very lucky to have this because we have a partner on the ground. And in new pilots in different situations, we may not find this kind of long-term partner, and that's exactly what we find in our research, that you do need that for the continuation and for the scaling up. And then there's one point I actually didn't mention that was on my slides, was talking about the community leaders. In India, as Mas said, we do this, but in the Ghana and Ethiopia pilots, we didn't do that partially because, well, we didn't have the partners on the ground, so we weren't sure if this would create power struggles if you were to include only the influential people or only the leaders, because it was the first time we entered this community. So we wanted it to be like, it just like, not random, but a certain criteria of the farmers have to be groundwater irrigators, for example, and the time that they have and such. But it was not specifically targeting the influential leaders. But actually, towards the end, in the results in Ghana, we found that the leaders are really influential, and in the debriefing, people were discussing this as a solution, that, okay, whatever rules we come up with should be through the community leaders and they should set it for us. So now that we have this validated, I think your point is very, very good, that yes, we definitely going forward need to be targeting them. Thanks.
There's another question here.
Thank you for the nice talks. I have a question. I mean, do you have any example of where those kind of games has been already applied in policy, and then to see if the results of the policy were similar to the game? For example, you are now, I don't know, designing a game for a reserve or a change on behavior on crops and so on, and then you have a policy that used your game for an implementation on an incentive or any, and if you can see that the policy was really working based on the game, like the application, implementation of games in policy making. Do you have any example of that? Because for example, in other exercises such as willingness to pay or choice modeling, I mean, there is always the question, no? You have the willingness, but does it really gonna happen in that way or not? And so I haven't found too many examples either with the willingness to pay or choice modeling. So I was wondering if you know an example for games implementation. Thank you.
Any of the other presenters want to try? I have a thing I want to say, but I don't want to be guy jumping in. I mean, one of the things I would say is where we're thinking of games as a way to learn about people's responses, I often think of them as earlier in the chain, as exploratory tools where it's impractical or unethical for whatever reason to do a full field trial, and we find a way to represent parts of the dilemma in a game to help us explore maybe if we were to do a trial to eventually try and shape policy, where might we invest first? And so, I mean, my first thought, and I would love to hear what others say, is I would be skeptical about designing policy based on gameplay only for the very reasons that you mentioned, that there's such a hypothetical bias that we kind of have to think about. So I would say they're wonderful in directing you in a very, where I don't know where to go next, or when I have too many directions to choose, it's a great way to refine where to look. But I would say it's probably never your last step before making a real choice. I don't know if others want to weigh in on that.
I don't know. I don't want to take too much time. I have something to add, but maybe we can also bilaterally talk afterwards, so that there are more opportunities for questions.
Yeah, thank you. I have just one question. In both of your talks at the beginning, it was that you separated on purpose men and women. And how much does it mimic really a real-world situation? Did you see what's the treatment effect of separating towards a mixed group? And yeah, what is implication?
Oh, really great questions. I love it. Yes, it depends actually on the community. So we have some communities where we really run the risk that if men and women are together in the room, the women would not talk at all. And in such communities, in particular, we split. And then for the impact assessment, we now standardized it across all the states. That's why it was standardized. But in other studies, we mixed the groups. And what we actually found in one study is that the more women leaders participated in the games, the more non-leading women participated as well in the session, and the stronger were the behavioral change outcomes we wanted to see. So it was really not just this normative logic of involving more women, it had even an instrumental outcome. And we are currently doing a study where we vary the proportion of women participating in the game, and we want to see how this affects what is happening in the game and after the game.
Yeah, thank you. Mine is just small. It's just a follow-up of what he was asking. And what I want to know here is whether you also try to check the effect of opinion leaders, because sometimes in a group there are some few people who are likely to influence others. Have you tried to check that as well? Thank you.
We control for leaders in our analysis. So yes, but it plays an important role. Yeah, we see that it affects the learning as well and the outcomes. Yeah.
Since in the discussion we've got a number of questions around, like, what are the things that we try and manage for, and how do we try and structure the participation, we're cutting close to this question that we struggle with, which is, again, if I'm interested in learning about how people respond to things or how they might respond, I'm going to be a careful social scientist in designing my different treatments. But if I'm going with the goal of experiential learning, I have this entirely different objective of trying to make whatever process I've produced as realistic as possible and try to sort of maximize how much the experience of joining the game mimics the experiences that people have in real life. And they don't always match up. And so this is this thing, again, I'm trying to sort of cheat death or talk out of both sides of my mouth in all the work that we do, where we try and do both. Whereas I think you've been much more successful, Thomas, in your campaigns of, like, we are going for the learning objective. So I mean, another way to turn the question is just, do you feel like you have to sacrifice a lot on the learning side in order to get, be able to isolate in an interesting way some treatment effect, or the other way around?
To be honest, yes. I mean, I'm getting into situations where I'm still pushed in introducing treatments into the games to learn from the game behavior, and I sometimes really struggle with this because my challenge is that these treatments may affect the learning, and what do I want to communicate. And sometimes the idea, what would be a nice experiment, for a research experiment, may trigger a way of thinking which I'm not fully sure would be ideal for getting a learning that makes people make more sustainable choices. So this is definitely one of my challenges. The other one is, of course, like if the partner is not happy with making payments, and it's a typical convention that in behavioral experiments you incentivize the players. Or these long sessions where you are not allowed to communicate with each other because you want to reduce the noise. This is not really helpful for the learning, because of course you learn by discussing. These are just some examples. Yeah.
So we're past 1, and y'all are being very polite and kind and giving us your time. Just to give a moment, if anyone needs to leave, please feel free, but also glad to take more questions if we're enjoying the discussion.
I have a question for Colin. So I was very curious about your game because I play these kind of games with my children. But when you started talking about the carbon line, I thought that the idea of the game was going to be more about how you compete for a more sustainable lifestyle based on carbon footprint data. So that's my question. Are you thinking about, in the same way that Catan has had different versions and Monopoly has had, are you thinking about a second version where you could use cards? So that basically, I don't know how the game would have to be structured according to the rules you presented, but essentially the winner would be the person that over a certain amount of, of plays has the more sustainable lifestyle with the cards that she or he manages to collect. Anyway, I don't know if you're thinking along these lines.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's at this point, the winner is whoever plays all of their cards first. And I think what my game, this is really good feedback, that like having a sense of ownership in the game, that you're moving toward a direction and that it's thematic. So the main goal of this game is to help build quantitative intuition around relative impact of day-to-day activities and societal events and policy choices. So I only got to show a couple of cards up there, but there's like 10 different decks of 20 cards each, and those decks are based around different categories. One of them is lifestyle changes, but there's also some that are policy-based. And so those decks are designed to get people thinking about how can we actually make changes and what are the relative impact of changes. But I really like this idea of also having the game player take a more active role in trying to like move toward a solution as opposed to just kind of abstractly playing the cards. Thank you. This isn't commercialized. I've never published games, but I do want to get it like kind of, once it's more developed, have it be more broadly available. And I'm open to that being like open source online or through a small publisher or something like that. And, yeah.
Yeah. So again, maybe it's again a small question, and probably it might be a bit different from what you have presented a little bit, but maybe related. And this is about a framed field experiment. Hope you have heard something like this. And so I just want to know, how does this frame field experiment, lab experiment in economics mostly, how do they relate with the games that you have just presented? That's one. And two, also in your games, have you think about the issues of external validity? Thank you.
So a quick answer there is that when I want an economist to take me seriously, I call it a frame field experiment. But so this challenges of, and sorry, I just jumped in. I'm doing this one. These challenges of both external validity and of construct validity, where we're sort of like trying to identify not just does the thing that we measured matter in other places, but is the thing that we're measuring actually a meaningful concept outside of the game at all? And this is something that kind of, there's almost it's a bit of a risk. I think people get excited about games and frame field experiments, and you see a lot of papers that come out that say, hey, we measured this thing, and we think it means this thing, and we're going to make a jump to a conclusion based on what we think it is without ever demonstrating that link between the thing that you measure and the construct that you care about. So that is one of the challenges with that is that I think you only build up construct and external validity by doing the game a whole bunch and finding ways in which the thing that someone did in the game relates to something somewhere else. Often, and I think we've heard some examples, we do surveys, we do other things to learn a little bit about what our players do in their real lives, and we try to see if there are any sort of like, correlations between what people do in the game and what they do in the real world. But that's really the loosest possible way to think about construct and external validity, and it really just takes time and sort of converging around methods in particular games or experiments in order to build it. But this is a real struggle, and where it's so critical for the application of games like this into areas like adaptation, for instance, is that it's only going to happen once, right? Like, we don't know any of these things that haven't happened yet, and we have this critical challenge of both having construct and external validity first in order to learn what these could do, but then also make a decision, you know what I mean? Like, we're going to have the problem that we won't know if it was valid until it was wrong, and this is a bit of a challenge. I don't know if anyone in the room has other things they want to say on this. Maybe Hagar?
Yeah, I just want to talk about the external validity part. And we talk about, this is really why we do the debriefing, or a big part of why we do the debriefing is to ask communities, like, how is this relatable to you? Was this realistic? Was it educational? What kind of things should we change going forward? And we kind of try to take their suggestions. And most of the time we get good feedback. Yes, it's been relatable. Yes, this is, relates to our life. You should let more people play this game or come back again or things like that. And sometimes they give really good constructive feedback. So in India, before my time, with Thomas and Ruth, that's actually how the groundwater game came to have this variation of rainfall, because it was all just standard rainfall, and then one of the people in India was playing the game, his feedback was, well, but rainfall is variable. How can you make recharge like this, like standard all the time? And that's how they changed it to become like, sometimes they like kind of play a dice, and then it's up to the dice, and then either you get good rainfall or low rainfall or some things like that. So it's a little bit how we try to do it. But definitely we could do more on that regard. And
yeah, Ruth wanted to say something.
So for our case, we do simulation-based experiments. So we simulate how it would affect the structure over a period of 25 years. So one of the things before you start in deciding which farms are going to be there, you have to talk to people. So we've talked to experts and farmers in these areas. And then also we've talked with them after. Okay, not in this current version because we are still developing the deep reinforcement learning framework, but in our model validations, we talk to the people in the region and find out if they would correspond to it. And we'll also do other policies in scenarios. For example, recently there were some new policies that were intend to be implemented, so we did show how it would change the structure of agriculture. So validation is quite a huge part of it, but to what extent, still don't know. And even if you talk to the policymakers and you tell them, you don't know if they will take your recommendations into practice. So still a long way to go.
Thank you. All right. I think I probably have to let our staff rest now. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, staff. And please don't be strangers, right? We come here because we want to talk about these things. So I think we're probably all excited if in a break you want to talk further.